As the war between Great Britain and Germany continues, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin remains confident that the non-aggression agreement he made with Germany will hold. From inside the Kremlin, Stalin believes the conflict could eventually give the Soviet Union greater influence on the world stage. His preferred strategy was for Britain, France, and Germany to weaken one another while the Soviet Union stayed out of the direct conflict and watched from the sidelines. In 1939, Stalin reached an agreement with Adolf Hitler. Despite the deep hostility between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Stalin signed what became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The agreement led to Germany and the Soviet Union dividing spheres of influence in Eastern Europe and invading Poland. It also included a Soviet commitment to provide Germany with large quantities of raw materials. In November, Stalin sent one of his most trusted officials, Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, to Berlin. Molotov was known for his endurance and discipline, and he was considered one of the few people Stalin placed great trust in. During his visit, Molotov met with German officials and discussed relations between the two countries. But while Molotov was in Berlin, Hitler and his military leadership were already considering a completely different course of action. Behind diplomatic discussions, Germany was secretly preparing for a future confrontation with the Soviet Union. On December 18, 1940, Hitler approved Führer Directive No. 21, outlining plans for a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The operation would eventually become known as Operation Barbarossa. As preparations continued, Hitler visited German weapons factories and inspected the military buildup. His objective was to invade Soviet territory and expand German control farther into Eastern Europe, which Nazi ideology described as the acquisition of Lebensraum, or living space. Although the German plans were kept secret, information about the planned invasion soon reached Soviet intelligence. Stalin received warnings from several different sources, including information from Berlin, British intelligence, American officials, and his network in Japan. But Stalin remained skeptical. He feared that the information could be part of a larger strategy by the Western powers to push the Soviet Union into a war with Germany before Stalin believed his forces were ready. As a result, many of the warnings were not acted upon with the urgency they deserved. Then, on June 22, 1941, everything changed. At dawn, more than 3 million German troops crossed into Soviet territory. Operation Barbarossa had begun. It was one of the largest military invasions ever attempted. The scale was enormous, involving thousands of tanks and aircraft, thousands of artillery pieces, and hundreds of thousands of vehicles. The German advance moved rapidly across Soviet territory. During the opening stages of the invasion, German forces captured huge numbers of Soviet troops and pushed hundreds of miles eastward. Moscow itself appeared to be in serious danger. On the morning of the invasion, Stalin was awakened by news from his chief of staff. The message was simple: the war had begun. The Soviet leader now faced the conflict he had spent years trying to avoid. 4 months later, the German advance encountered another major obstacle: the brutal Soviet winter. German forces had moved deep into Soviet territory, but their supply lines were stretched, and their troops were facing severe weather and growing shortages. Meanwhile, Stalin received intelligence from his agent in Tokyo that Japan was not planning an immediate attack against the Soviet Union from the east. Instead, Japanese forces were preparing to move south toward British, French, and Dutch territories in Asia, with the possibility of conflict involving the United States. This information gave Stalin an opportunity. He transferred hundreds of thousands of troops from the Soviet Far East toward Moscow. These forces were experienced in cold weather operations and arrived with tanks, artillery, aircraft, and winter equipment. On December 5, 1941, Stalin ordered a major Soviet counteroffensive. The timing was critical. German troops were exhausted, supply lines were struggling, and the harsh winter had made their situation even more difficult. The Soviet forces launched a powerful attack against the German positions around Moscow. The German advance was finally stopped, and German forces were pushed back more than 100 miles in some areas. The immediate threat to Moscow had been reduced. Over the following weeks, Soviet forces continued to resist the German advance and began pushing the Wehrmacht farther west. For the first time since Operation Barbarossa began, the German offensive had been decisively halted. Stalin had managed to stop the advance toward Moscow, but the war on the Eastern Front was far from over.